G'day everyone, it's James Davis from the Pax8 Academy again. I've got Michael joining me from Orchestry. Thanks for joining me, Michael. How are you doing?
Good, James. How are you? Good to chat again here.
I'm going well. Where are you based?
So I know you can't tell by the accent. So originally Australian, grew up in Australia, but have been here in Canada, so Vancouver, Canada, for the last 15 years.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. I'm excited to have you on because we get to talk about collaboration governance and information management, and it's something that's becoming more and more prominent. And I thought, why not get a bit of an expert on this to come in and help us understand this world a bit more. So let's dive in, and I'll ask you a nice, simple question. What is collaboration governance and information management?
So start off with the simple stuff. So definitely in terms of Microsoft 365, I mean, probably the first thing that we like to talk about is what some of the issues, right, that customers are facing and what we're facing. And I think what we're seeing broadly across Microsoft 365 customers is two main challenges. One of them is this kind of challenge of governance, right? So content sprawl, people creating stuff everywhere. It's very difficult to kind of get a handle on all of that in Microsoft 365 because you've got multiple tools, multiple capabilities. The platform is really designed to make that experience of creating content as frictionless as possible. So lots of content, lots of sprawl, people not being able to find anything, and people getting generally annoyed, right, with the situation that they're in. And really, the idea with collaboration governance is how can we put some guardrails into that process, not to lock it down completely, but to introduce a little bit of friction to make sure that we're using correct information management, to make sure that people are using these tools securely. So that process of collaboration governance is really, how do we apply rules, whether they're manual or whether they're automated, to make sure that our end users can still do what they need to do, but also ensure things like security and findability and everything else. The other part of this, as we've discussed as well, is I think that governance conversation is just one part of a broader conversation, because I really believe that governance and adoption are kind of two sides of the same coin, right? So, there's no point governing stuff if people aren't creating anything. But conversely, there's no point people creating a whole bunch of stuff if it's not governed, because either way, long term or even short term, you're going to be in trouble. So the other part around Microsoft 365 is that adoption piece, right? Around, again, this kind of what to use when problem in Microsoft 365, where you have this huge amount of capabilities, lots of overlap in feature sets. God only knows how many more times they're going to change names of things, right? In terms of what's called, and then really end users not knowing what to use when, right? And the way that we try to approach it with our customers as well, how can we put governance in place where we can put some guardrails in for organizations, where even from an end user side, we're guiding them to use the right tools at the right time. So we should be using OneDrive in this type of scenario, or we should be using Teams in this type of scenario, or SharePoint in this type of scenario, for example. So it's really kind of all encompassing. It really is that strategy, James, of really helping people make sense of Microsoft 365 to be able to collaborate in kind of a self-efficient manner, but also making sure that they're actually getting the value out of the tools that they're paying for. Because I don't know what you see, but we see far too many organizations, paying for E3s or E5s, and they're using it for email and for chat, right? They're not really using any of those capabilities that M365 provides. And again, that collaboration governance and the adoption piece is really built around making sure they get value out of their investment in Microsoft 365.
Yeah, I see a lot around MSPs and SIs that are doing them 365 projects, and ones that are a bit more advanced than just having email and chat. They're typically doing more lift and shift projects of files from on-prem and putting into SharePoint and doing the same things, and they haven't really taken into account this collaboration, governance, and adoption side that you're talking about. Why do you think that is? Like, what do you think's the driver for us to do it that way?
I think for I think for MSPs in particular, it's just an easier way to do things, right? And I think that's a very dangerous thing. I think you're going to have a lot of disappointed users if you're telling them that you're going to take this stuff from on-prem file shares, you're going to stick it up in the cloud, and it's going to be exactly the same structure, and you're going to get the same type of experience. It just doesn't work like that. I mean, I think fundamentally Microsoft 365 is very different than a file share. It's also very different than SharePoint on premise, right, James? And we see that a lot, same that, we're doing a migration up to the cloud. We're just going to take our one or two SharePoint sites with billions of documents in there and just, slam them into Microsoft 365. I think, one of the issues is that Microsoft 365 is complicated, right? It's a complex product with lots of different pieces. And even from that information architecture perspective, a lot of organizations aren't doing that because on the consulting side, it's difficult to have those skills to understand that. And B, in a lot of cases, you kind of want to see, you don't want to introduce too much change to an organization, right? And that's the other thing that we see, even though it's probably the best kind of, some short-term pain for some long-term gain. But again, we see that a lot, and we see a lot of organizations running into trouble, right? I mean, particularly certain types of organizations, engineering companies, for example, they've used file shares. They have these massive AutoCAD files. Someone's like, we're going to move it all up into Microsoft 365. They move it up there and the performance is awful, right? Because you've got these massive files, you're not kind of downloading them locally. But saying that, I mean, there's so many advantages if you can change the way that people work, right? In terms of, let's not have everything within a file share with permissions and, emails and all of that sort of stuff. Let's start to use things like Teams from a collaboration perspective. Let's start inviting external users in a more organized fashion through guest or external access. But again, it's that lift and shift model is difficult because, again, you're just trying to get the stuff up into the cloud in the first place, but also having the skills and those analytical skills to help, customers understand what the benefits is, and doing it technically is obviously pretty difficult.
And on that point of if we're trying to look at this differently, you mentioned a few points there, but if you were looking at let's use an engineering client as a good example that you mentioned, how would you go about looking at this process of taking them from on-prem to cloud? What's that architecture process actually look like?
Yeah, so I mean, engineering an example is a really interesting one because I just don't think there's a good solution at the moment for M365 for these very, very large files, particularly around AutoCAD. So what I would do is, and what we find is, pick particular use cases, James, that you want to concentrate on, right? And kind of get people used to working in those new ways for use cases. So best example for any organizations is probably projects, right? So project management in terms of, instead of maybe we're running these projects on an Excel file, right? And we've got, a distribution list and all the document management is being done by email. Why don't we start to use Microsoft Teams, right? Use that from a project management perspective, use the capabilities around channels to have all of our conversations centralized, for example, start inviting in external users through some of the guest access capabilities and features, and use, task management capabilities. Maybe it's Planner, maybe it's Microsoft Lists, or if you need something a little bit more formal, using Project Online. But I truly believe that kind of use case based approach is really where you want to do it at. So we've done projects with customers where maybe the first use case is, again, project management, or maybe it's departmental collaboration. We just recently did one with Orchestry as a new template that we have around onboarding employees, right? So every time an employee comes on board, we create a Microsoft team. That whole onboarding process is done through there. IT communicate with them, HR can communicate with them, all of those pieces. But I think, email is fairly similar. It's like for like, right? I mean, whether you're on-prem or online, it's fairly similar. Just that structuring, though, around file management and collaboration is very different between M365 online and on-prem. And it can be almost too much change for users, right? And you've seen it as well, James, where people are just like, no, just give me the same experience. Just give me the file share, stick it in one SharePoint site, and we'll be good to go. And that just becomes a horrible mess because, I mean, the typical thing we see is someone does that. They say the files are too slow. They're like, excellent, we have this tool called OneDrive, just sync everything down locally through the OneDrive client. OneDrive can only support, I think it's like 500,000 documents, and then it all goes terribly right there. So again, that's some of the things that you might want to consider.
But that use case principle is very interesting, and it makes a whole lot of sense to actually understand what individual solutions of solving business problems. As you were talking through that, just that example of like a project and all the different components to it, that sounds like a lot of sprawl very quickly across lot of different Microsoft products, having to spin up SharePoint lists and different things. That sounds like it could get very complicated very quickly. Is that the case?
It does. I mean, the thing with Microsoft 365, it's whether you agree with it or not, that's the way the platform is designed, right? The platform is really designed around, we have this thing called a group, right? Add this group, we can add all of these capabilities and all of these features. And really the way that Microsoft has designed M365 is you've got kind of these groups, right, which have Teams or SharePoint as part of them. And these kind of get treated as these kind of units, right, which can be kind of, spun up and then, kind of removed later on down the line. I don't think, I mean, it's one of those things where people talk about that sort of sprawl, but I think the big advantage of that, or one of the things, is at least getting people to use the same tools within Microsoft 365 for the same purpose. So if we're talking about project management, here's how we do projects in our organization. We create a team. That team has a naming convention. It has a bunch of different channels for different things around the particular project. We use Planner to manage all of our tasks. And we have a Microsoft list template to have a risk register, for example, right? Everyone does the same thing. Every project's the same. It's all good. What we see at the moment is if you don't have that strategy in place, is that one project manager is like, yep, I'm going to create a folder in my OneDrive, right? And I'm going to use Excel to manage tasks, and everything's going to be there, and all of the conversation is going to be done through email. Another person just going to spin up a SharePoint site, right? And again, they might use SharePoint for the file management capability. Maybe they use a third-party tool from a task management piece, and a third person uses a Microsoft team. That sprawl to me, James, is a little bit more insidious. We call that application sprawl because, again, right, everyone is doing something different. So that's where the real issue is. And unfortunately with Microsoft 365, it is like a Lego approach, right? You can kind of put these pieces together and kind of build whatever you want to. But without a little bit of consistency and a little bit of planning within an organization, again, for the kind of, for the general end user, it just becomes incredibly confusing to understand what's going on. I mean, a good example is managing tasks in Microsoft 365. I mean, there's like 10 different ways, right? So again, if you're working in this space, guiding your customers around, listen, a project or a task management tool, let's use Planner for the majority of situations. It's not going to do everything that we want, but at least it's going to give us some consistency there. And then getting people, again, to kind of use those tools correctly and consistently can really provide some huge benefits.
Yeah, I can understand that as you're talking through. This is the opportunity for us as those technology partners to go in and help them discover what use cases they've got, help them create the processes, and then train on the adoption of actually using it. But I suppose as you're talking about this, what goes to my brain as an ex-MSP owner is it's shadow IT. If we're starting to control it now, how much interaction do we need to have every time they need to do a project? Are we involved, or are we trying to enable our users to just self-service a lot better? What's your sort of perspective on that?
I mean, I think ultimately you want to be able to self-service the organization, right? You want to get them into a state where I think you're more of that trusted advisor role. And how to get to that role is how do we enable the people within the organization to do what they need to do on a daily basis, and then really use the MSP as more of that strategic guidance sort of level. There's tools that can help implement that. Obviously, Orchestry is one of those things from a templating perspective and a lifecycle management perspective. But I mean, we also see the opposite, James. We also see some companies who are just like, we're too busy. We just want an MSP, want to call someone and say, we want to do a project, just make it appear, right? So I think there's opportunities for both. But ultimately, what we're seeing out there in the industry is that, the technology is easy, the technology works. Putting it together and working out how to leverage it the most effectively for an organization, that's where the value is right now. So it's less around, trying to install servers and technically understand things and making it work. It's there, it's available. I think really where the magic is and where the value is for customers is having, for instance, an MSP that can come in and say, okay, let's look at these processes that you have. Let's look at the technology that you have available. How can we mold both of these into something that's going to provide you value?
And that just opens up so many more opportunities as well for those people that do go in and understand the business processes, because it's not just what we're talking about today around the collaboration governance. It starts to flow into, well, process automation, business transformation type activity, that can drive a whole lot more value and revenue and margin through. Um, just along the lines of the governance, because that's what we're really talking about. We're talking about creating a framework for our clients to work within, so that they can be more empowered to do what they need to do. But as we're creating all of these different projects, as an example, and it just keeps adding more and more, how do we actually manage that in terms of like making sure we're backing up the data, making sure we're controlling access to the information? It sounds like it can get very big very quickly.
It can. So there's definitely Microsoft 365 capabilities that come out of the box, right? So, from a data management, from a data backup, there's backup solutions. In terms of, let's say, life cycle, so that's obviously pretty important. What happens once a project is done, right? Do we just keep all of this stuff forever? There's some out of the box capabilities that Microsoft provides around things like group expiration. So, you have all of these projects, right? Once they're done and no one uses it for a while, you can set up a policy that's going to go and ask the owners, do you still need this or not? And then again, they can go through a kind of an archival or a deletion process. There's lots of other third-party tools as well that can help facilitate that process as well. And again, it's a huge opportunity, we feel, for kind of services revenue. So a good example is a project, right? We've got some organizations that are creating thousands of projects a year. Last thing you want is to have thousands of teams and thousands of groups just open forever, right? Guests having access to that stuff forever because they're not cleaned up. So, huge opportunities around helping organizations, not only on the front part of it in terms of collaboration governance around how do we get this thing created, what are we going to call it, what's the structure going to be, who's going to have access. But the bigger opportunity we're finding for a lot of customers at the moment is, what do we do with all of the stuff that we have at the moment? Because the concept of, team sprawl at the moment is very, very prevalent within the industry. And the reason for that is, again, Microsoft makes it super easy. I need a team, I go create team, and it's there forever, right? Basically, unless I do anything. But that opportunity around having some sort of life cycle management around that, what happens if something hasn't been used for 6 months, right? Can we go and contact the owner of that team? If we go through an archival process, can we do things like maybe remove previous versions, right? Lots of customers running into pretty significant challenges around storage because of the way that M365 handles version history. So some governance rules around, let's say, a project. Once a project is done, we have to go and, let's say, remove previous versions of content, get rid of access for all of the guests, for instance. You don't want these people there, long term. Maybe change permissions, change the name of the actual project so people know that it's been archived, and then, do a couple of other things as well. So that's, I think, the huge opportunity for a lot of partners at the moment, is really helping customers, obviously on the creation side. But a lot of the customers that come to us, now it's probably because the type of tool that we have kind of attracts those, but a lot of customers that come to us, the story is, we put in Microsoft 365, 5 years ago or 2 years ago, right? Everything was going great. We were going to do a big governance implementation. COVID happened. So our governance implementation went from 6 months to 48 hours because everyone went remote over the weekend. So we didn't have time. So people could create teams and SharePoint sites and groups and all of that sort of stuff wherever and whenever they wanted. And now a lot of organizations are coming back and saying, well, help us understand what we have. And how do we not get into this state, right, that we are at the moment? Because, a typical thing is, let's say me and you are in the same company, James. We're doing a project with Nike. We go and search for, let's say, a project team called Nike, and we get 50 back, right? 3 of them are called Project Nike, so you have no idea who they are. That's if you even have access to them. A lot of the times you're going to search for them, I don't have access to it, and you don't have access to it, James. So guess what you're going to do? You're going to create another Project Nike and so on, right? So that type of governance approach and setting those rules and having some capabilities around that, again, massive opportunity really around information management and governance for partners and for customers as well. I mean, customers don't want to be in this state. They really want the information to be managed correctly.
I like what you said there before around the users have created their own problems, so they're very aware of it. So this isn't something that we're having to come in and go explain and try and sell them on the fact that they've got a problem. Nearly everyone that uses M365 and Teams and stuff know they've got a problem of how to use it and where the data is and the sprawl that's created by dissimilar methods of doing things inside the organization. And what you're talking there about life cycle, it has me interested because obviously, like I look at Teams, I use it all the time. Like what you're mentioning, channels pop up all the time, and it is very transactional. So that life cycle stuff it makes a whole lot of sense. So, and I'm curious from your perspective, what's some generic high-level best practices around that sort of life cycle management? What should we be thinking about? What should we be thinking about how we archive it? Where does the data go? When do we actually delete stuff?
Yeah, so I mean, in general, there's definitely some I think best practice rules around structuring, let's say, Microsoft Teams across an organization. So in a lot of organizations, they tend to structure their information management across one of two patterns. One pattern, which I think is more correct, is that everything is its own individual team. So let's say, James, you're working with a customer, right? That customer has 10 projects. Each one of those projects is going to be its own individual team, and it's going to have a life cycle and a management piece around that. Now, the reason that works quite well is from a life cycle management perspective, the out-of-the-box capabilities that Microsoft provides are really around that group and SharePoint site and team level. They're not really doing it on the channel side of things as much. So again, we have a project, we create one of these things, it has a set structure, it has everything else there. Once that project is done, we go through the process of kind of spinning that down and doing all of these things. Now, again, out of the box, there's not really many capabilities to do that. There is certain third-party tools that do that. Of course, Orchestry is one of those, of course. But it can also be done manually. Now, again, the problem with it then being done manually is no one ever does it because everyone's too busy, right? Especially for, hey, we have this stuff 6 months ago. Once I'm finished with it, as far as I'm concerned, it's kind of dead to me there. The other approach which we see is less teams, but lots of channels. So for instance, let's say for you, James, you run a consulting company, for instance, or a professional services company. You have a team per customer, and every engagement you have with that team is its own individual channel, right? The issue with that is that it becomes problematic. There's no real concept of being able to archive channels, right? There's no real concept of security across the channels unless you start using private channels. Private channels have a whole bunch of issues themselves as well. So again, even though it looks easier from the end user side because it's like, oh, we have a customer, go into this customer team and see all of the projects, it really is a little bit more difficult to be able to kind of manage that long term in Microsoft 365. But again, what we would say is the way that Microsoft has developed M365 is really based around that, a team or a group or a SharePoint site is based around that kind of individual work unit piece, right? So, every project, for instance, it's going to be its own team. We have a lot of customers in the construction space where if they do like an incident, for instance, right? Every incident is its own team. And when an incident happens, a team gets spun up, people get added, there's a bunch of tasks, there's a bunch of channels to discuss those things, the photos go in, that incident happens. And then once that incident is resolved, then there's a process of kind of spinning that down as well. The same thing with employee onboarding and offboarding. We've got a lot of customers which are starting to use Teams for onboarding employees, right? So before an employee starts, James, we create you a team. In that team, you have all of the tasks that IT needs to do, that legal needs to do, that HR needs to do. that team kind of lives with that employee over time. So, their manager might have access to that team so they can have, 360 reviews or whatever else through there. When that employee leaves, again, that team gets removed, but all of the content gets moved into some sort of central storage mechanism. Now, unfortunately, everything that I've talked about in terms of moving content and so forth, again, that's not really an out-of-the-box capability. It's where these third-party tools come in. But again, it's really important of how you manage that. One of the things that I would say, and we see this a lot in customers, particularly that aren't experienced in Microsoft 365, is like, we want to keep everything forever. So they just apply a blanket retention policy on every single piece of content they have, right? And it's really easy to do that. Go in, apply retention, and then you can never delete anything at any time, ever. Now, people think that's a really good idea, but it's a terrible idea because it opens you up to security, it opens you up to compliance issues, right? But also from a storage and a growth perspective, it just becomes really difficult. Like in the end, you have to treat that content some way. You're either deleting it, or alternatively, you're kind of storing it. But far too many customers we see, and we see a lot of MSPs do this because they're worried that people are going to accidentally delete something. Just like, let's just put a blanket retention policy on everything, and nothing ever gets deleted. And then you just see content grow over time, and then they wonder why are we paying Microsoft for 30 additional terabytes of storage a month? Well, it's because you can't delete anything because you've actively told M365 that we're not going to.
That's some really good insights about the life cycle and using the team and group concept, because I would automatically default to thinking around the channel approach makes the most sense, and so that sort of wisdom is really helpful. And as you were talking about that the collaboration governance piece, what stuck out to me is we're starting to govern it. What sort of metrics and insights are we able to get out of once you've got that structure? Like, what have you seen people use for the benefit of their clients or their own businesses?
So the big thing is inactivity, right? So just, are we creating things which are actively being used or not? And I can tell you over how many teams we kind of managed last night for our customers, and it was close to like 1.7 million across all of our customers, right? The inactivity rate is somewhere around probably 20% of these things are active, right? So you got a lot of this kind of content and data which is sitting there and not being touched for months, weeks, or potentially years. But if you start seeing the inactivity rate drop, so people are creating things and actively using them, that's kind of what you want to see, right? Because again, you've got this kind of smaller subset of content that people are actively managed. The other thing that I would also look at as well is just from the perspective of end user satisfaction, right? We really see that with a lot of customers, that especially around Microsoft 365, the common thing is, James, we have Microsoft 365, they just gave it to us. We have no idea what we're doing with this. I don't know what SharePoint is, I don't know what OneDrive is. But again, providing some of those rules and some guardrails in place can be really beneficial. And I truly believe that end users, they don't want Teams or SharePoint sites or none of that crap. They just don't care. They want to manage projects, they want to respond to RFPs, create an incident report, all of that stuff. So again, that's why that use case based scenario can be very powerful in terms of, here's how we're going to use these tools for this particular use case. From a training perspective as well, it's really powerful. Like, I just don't fundamentally believe this concept of kind of Microsoft 365 training, right? That we're going to train these people and then they're going to become experts and then people are going to build their own SharePoint sites. Like, I mean, you're laughing, James, but like, who is doing this? No one's doing this, right? Because it's a complex thing. So this idea of having these templates ready to rock and roll for them, where they can just go in and say, listen, I want to do a project. Everything is built out for me. Let's go. That's the sort of thing where I think can provide a huge amount of values and tons of services opportunities as well for MSPs in particular, and helping define that. And then also from a training perspective, like, let's train you how to use this thing in Microsoft 365 that we've defined for you, as opposed to let's train you in the 12 different ways to create a document in Microsoft 365. So you're going to be in the position then to work out what the best way is when you're under the pressure of doing this. It just doesn't happen. So again, that's really where that value is. And I know that could be a little bit controversial. I'm not saying don't train people on Microsoft 365. Train them to understand the base capabilities, but also offer, specific use case based approaches. Because from what we see across our customers, and a lot of customers are very mature technically, it's probably less than 20% of anything is customized. So people create a team, they don't do anything with it, right? There's a couple of documents in there, and all the conversations are done in one-to-one chat, right? Very rarely people are going in and adding lists and libraries and pages and web parts, right? And power apps and all of that sort of stuff. We see that less and less. That's why I really like that use case based approach and giving people a really good starting point.
I think I agree 100%. It's there's no point generically training the end users on 365. We need to get better at enabling them to do their job, and here's the tools that you've got at your disposal to do that. It's a very different approach. It's much more successful. It's what they care about. It's what they understand. It's a lot more focused, and they'll get a lot more productive out of it. And thinking about productivity, what I'm curious about is looking a bit into the future, and AI is obviously coming out, and Copilot and stuff. How do you envisage that's going to affect the collaboration and information management space? What do you think we need to look at and think about?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always a pessimist about new technology. I know that I'm very excited by it, but I'm also a little bit of a pessimist around it as well. I mean, I think the potential is huge, and Microsoft is obviously, leveraging that effectively. I think definitely that it can help, right, in terms of creation and all of those pieces as well. Conversely, I also think it's going to expose particularly a lot of challenges around security within Microsoft 365. So I'll give you a really good, it's my favorite example to use. Let's imagine, James, that you're starting, it's a big new company, right? And you, because you're an inquisitive sort of chap, is interested in finding out what I make from a salary perspective at the same company. Now, without Copilot and all of that intelligence, you're using Microsoft Search and maybe you'll find something somewhere. But Copilot should be smart enough for you to be able to go in and say, show me the salary of Michael. Maybe it's some document 30 levels down somewhere that you, for some reason, have permissions and have access to, right? Now, I think that's going to be a pretty interesting use case for a lot of customers where they're going to find that, it's like with the file share. You know how people have these huge long file shares and permissions broken and someone accidentally goes and finds, a spreadsheet or a document, for instance. If Copilot's really good, that should be pretty easy to find through that tool. So I think for customers in particular, that idea of understanding their security posture and using some of the tools like Purview from an information security perspective and information management perspective is going to be really interesting. The only thing I worry about with Copilot is, again, if people are just going in and creating stuff wherever, and we further abstract that process, so they don't even know where this stuff's created, right? They're just expecting, Copilot to be able to find that for them and to create that for them. I wonder if that's going to also pose some risks there as well. So I think there's definitely a bit of a balance there. Again, I think the technology, it looks amazing, right, in terms of what it can do, particularly from a generative perspective. But I don't think it's going to be the panacea to bad information management or to a lack of governance. I think, if anything, it's probably going to expose some of those challenges more in organizations.
And I agree that the example of being able to find the data, you shouldn't be able to, and not using DLP and that sort of stuff. Most organizations don't have that set up. And it is going to expose a lot of these issues. So I see there's an opportunity for us to get in front of our clients and start talking about this governance ahead of time, so we can better prepare people for AI readiness, and get the projects early, clean things up. This whole conversation around the collaboration governance, we can enable people before it even comes to bear, and then continue that sort of momentum forward. it's a really interesting topic for me, and I could talk about this a lot, and I've learned a lot from you today and what you're talking about. But this is probably a good place to wrap up, and I'll ask you, what do you want people to take away from today? You've spoken about a lot of topics. If there's one single point that you really want people to hammer in on, what would it be? And if people are starting to get interested and they've been sparked their curiosity about collaboration governance, where do you get started?
Yeah, I think the main takeaway is, really with your customers or within your organization, look at adoption and governance as two sides of the same coin, right? There really has to be that balance there, James, between how do we enable our end users and conversely, how do we provide enough guardrails in place, right? To make sure that we're going to be secure and going to be successful long term. If you're interested in collaboration and governance, reach out to me. Obviously, again, I represent a company called Orchestry where we have a lot of these capabilities out of the box, built out, things like templates, but also a whole range of tools around advanced lifecycle management and reporting and everything else. But if you're an MSP, I just think there's huge potential there from a services and becoming that trusted advisor sort of perspective. I mean, you always talk, James, we want to move the MSP space from just keeping the lights on into providing some real value. I think that area around information management and governance and adoption, there's just so much value there. And a lot of it is very low hanging fruit, right, for companies. So yeah, I would definitely say, explore those capabilities and those offerings, because there's definitely a need in the market for it now. And I, definitely consider that that's going to be further a need going forward.
Well, I think there's some great points you've wrapped up on there, and I see immense opportunity. This is a good place to start, evolving yourself into a technology solutions partner, elevating yourself up as a trusted advisor, and getting more involved in the business. Because again, people know they have Teams issues. They know that they're struggling to see what's going on, and it's very transactional. They know they've got it, so it it's not starting from a place of unaware problem that we're having to educate them on. So very much agree with what you've been saying, and I think you've shared some awesome insights into this area, and I hope the partners listening to this conversation has got a lot out of it and see some opportunity and go take it. So thanks so much for joining me today, Michael, and I'm sure I'll have you again in the future.
Nice one. Thanks, James. Appreciate the time.
Thanks, mate.